Hello. Thank you for coming. I did realize I don't actually explain what Pentiment is. I'll do that briefly just in case people decided to come here for no particular reason. But welcome to my talk, Painting on Silicon, about the making of Pentiment. If you don't know who I am, my name is Josh Sawyer. I'm the studio design director at Obsidian Entertainment. We are a game developer located in Orange County in Southern California. We've been around we're celebrating our 21st year this year. I got my start in the game industry in the late 90s at a company called Black Isle Studios, also in Irvine, California. We worked on role-playing games. Two of them that I worked on are at the top, Icewind Dale 1 and 2. Between 2003 and 2005, I briefly was in San Diego working for Midway on a Gauntlet game, but I decided to go back to my roots with my old co-workers at Obsidian, which was formed by a lot of people from Black Isle Studios, where I've been ever since. Most notably, while I've been at Obsidian, I've worked on directing Fallout New Vegas and Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, and most recently Pentiment. Very briefly, Pentiment is a 16th century narrative adventure game set in Oberbayern, Upper Bavaria, and it's about an artist named Andreas Maler who gets caught up in a series of murders that he tries to unravel over the course of 25 years. It is a fairly small team, or was a very small team, and a fairly small scope of game with a stylistic approach to art and a lot of choice and consequence in its storytelling. Most of what I focus on in my day-to-day job is directing, so I am a game director. If you want to simplify what that is, that's very equivalent to a film director. I have the high-level vision of the creative direction of the project. But I also do narrative design, which is writing, but also the development of story and world building within the setting, and system design, which is to say mechanical design, all the stuff that drives the gameplay. Pentiment does not have a whole lot of gameplay. It is really more about the narrative. And today I'm not going to talk so much about the game dev side of it as much as about sort of the inspiration and the academic sources that went into it, because, well, we're at a university library. So, just to briefly go through all the stuff I'm going to talk about, so you can think about questions to ask me at the end, because I didn't talk about the thing you wanted to hear. I'm going to talk about my historical background, how I became interested in history as a subject. Also, the historical background of the game, which I think is interesting. Otherwise, why would I have made the game? Briefly, I'll talk about the project scope and the team structure. This is as deep as I'll probably get into game dev until I talk about the fonts, because I want to talk about the fonts. The genesis of the art style. One of the most noteworthy things about it, for which I can take no credit at all, is the art style developed by my art director, Hannah Kennedy, but we pulled from a lot of historical sources for it. The music, because it's cool. I'm going to talk about the fonts ad nauseum, because this is probably the venue to talk about it. How we develop the writing style and the voices, which is to say, how do we convey the idea of these characters living very far away from us in time, but make them feel approachable. Also, the difficulties of representing belief and devotion. Religion is a difficult topic, even in a modern setting. In a historical setting, there are added complexities as well. Books and bookmaking, because, again, here we are. Some of the sources in academia that were involved in making the project, it wasn't just me. I do not have the academic background to do justice to all of this. And then also I will admit to various archaeological sins and historical gray areas that I played with kind of fast and loose, because I needed to. And finally, I'm just going to end talking about my opinions about the use of historical art and history in games. So, my historical background. When I was pretty young, about 10 years old, I was interested in role-playing games, computer role-playing games and tabletop role-playing games. Mostly fantasy, and fantasy role-playing games often have a quasi-pseudo-medieval feeling to them. They're not quite medieval, they're not quite early modern, they're kind of European in this big mishmash. And so I was interested in, like, how does armor work? Where did this come from? What is the feudal system? The feudal system. How does any of this work? So that was probably the start of my interest in this general topic. Then in 1992, I played a game called Darklands, which was a computer role-playing game, and it was very different from most of the ones that I'd played before. It was not like Dungeons and Dragons. It wasn't set in a fantastic realm. It was set in 15th century, quote-unquote, Greater Germany, the Holy Roman Empire. And its approach to handling things like wizards And priests was very different. So instead of having a wizard that cast spells, you would have an alchemist, and an alchemist would make alchemical potions using formulae from Albertus Magnus and Michael Scott and other historical figures associated with alchemy. Instead of having a cleric that would cast spells, you would have someone with high virtue who could read Latin and would read the vitae of the saints, and then they could invoke the saint to help them in battle. So it was a very interesting way of approaching it because it wasn't pure fantasy. It really tried to ground everything in history, including, this is the first game that I saw that had a bibliography. And in fact, many of the books that I referenced in my own library were pulled from that bibliography. So this had a big impact on me. The idea of using history in a game, even if it was somewhat fantastical, was very appealing to me. In high school and college, I was also involved in theater. I was very interested in Shakespeare's histories, notably Henry V and Richard III, which play kind of fast and loose with the details of history. One of the first papers I did in college was examining Henry V and how what we know now, or what we believe we know now, about what happened at Agincourt and other things like that, how that works with Hollingshead Chronicles, which is what Shakespeare pulled from. Eventually, I did get a bachelor's degree. I started as a music major, a singer, but I eventually went over to from the conservatory to the college. I got a degree in history from Lawrence University. I focused on witch hunting and hagiography in the early modern era, specifically in the Holy Roman Empire. And then I went into games. So I didn't know how I was going to use it. I would say, though, that having a liberal arts background was very helpful to me in games, but the specific application of my historical focus, I didn't know how that was ever going to come into play, but I did have something in my mind that I wanted to do a historical game. It took 20 years to do it. And part of that was that there's a lot of resistance in games to making historical games because people have bad experiences with history as an academic subject. So there's a lot of resistance, like, well, we don't want you to make a boring game. Why don't you assume that I'm going to do the cool parts of history? So it was quite challenging, but that's the road that I went down. Speaking of roads, here's the We Are in Paris. To talk about the background of where the game is set, when in time and where in place. I've always been interested in times in transition, so the Northern Renaissance, very important. Lots of things are changing. We have this broad period of history we call the Middle Ages, which encompasses a huge amount of stuff. But then around the 15th century, the Northern Renaissance starts kicking off. One of the big things is the printing press, or rather the more important thing is movable type, because the printing presses were wine presses. There wasn't anything technologically super advanced about them. It was the invention of movable type and being able to fit those sorts into the patterns. That's what allowed printing to really take off. And once it took off in the mid-15th century, it exploded. So the profusion of existing texts into print and more widespread distribution of it, as well as the creation of new texts, not only in Latin, but also in local languages that ordinary people could read. There was a rise in literacy because priests would start to teach people how to read and write. So all of this contributed to a rise in literacy and spread of texts. It had big impacts. The Reformation occurred, and the Reformation was in part sort of fueled and aided by print. The Revolution of 1525, also known as the German Peasants' War. There had been other peasant revolutions. In the previous century in Germany, there had been one. In the previous century in France, there had been the Jacquerie, which was extremely bloody and brutal. But these were very unfocused. They were very incoherent. The peasants were very mad, but there wasn't a unifying idea behind them. But print and the printing of the 12 Articles really galvanized, especially the Swabian peasants, to rise up against their overlords. So print really contributed a lot to the transformation of Europe at this time, and of course it's very interesting to me. But why Upper Bavaria? So it's maybe an unusual location, but there were certain things that appealed to me. One is that the Imperial Road, the Wien in Paris, it goes through Innsbruck, down into Augsburg, and then all the way north, and it goes all the way down to Rome. So this was a major route by which information, people, culture could travel north and south. Having our communities set nearby gave us access to all of that. Also, setting it between Swabia and Salzburg, where there were major uprisings of peasants and miners, meant that we could have these things on the periphery without overwhelming the entire narrative. So in the end, it was remote but not isolated, and that made it ideal. And also it's fictional. Everything in the game, this location, this town, and this abbey were made up. what I found in doing research is that there were lots of communities that had one or two elements that I wanted for the story, but not all of them. So in the end, I just mashed a bunch of Bavarian towns together and a bunch of Bavarian abbeys together. And I was very happy because I heard after the fact that a bunch of Bavarians who had played the game went looking, like they looked up Tassing, they looked up Kiersau because they sounded and felt real because of all the details put in them. They're not, they're all made up. You know, there's a town here that might have had a double monastery. There's a town here that had a legend about a nymph. There's a town here that had, you know, some female scribe that was noteworthy. So all of that stuff mashed into this fictional location made it much easier to tell the story I wanted. But it's much like in Name of the Rose. Umberto Eco invented his abbey. It's not a real abbey. If he can do it, I can do it too. Just briefly to talk about the scope of the project. Oh geez, I gotta hurry up. It was a 3-year project. That is neither especially long nor short in game development. That's kind of typical, although for me it's the longest I've ever worked on a project. Our pre-production was 9 months. This is us figuring out the look and the feel of the game, how the characters looked in the environment, how we did quests and the murder trials and things like that. And then we had a little over 2 years to do the production itself, which was taking the prototype, turning it into a vertical slice, and expanding it into the full structure of the game. There were 13 developers at any given time. I think in the next chart you'll see there were 15 people, but that's because some people came and left. We wrote 325,000 words, or 33,000 lines of dialogue, which to some people sounds like a lot, but for Obsidian is actually about half as much as a typical game that we make. Pillars of Eternity 1 was about 600,000 words, Deadfire was about 850,000 words, I think. So for us, small, but it was only 4 writers. So it was a big endeavor. And when it was released in English, French, Italian, German, and Spanish, what we call FIGs. It's just what we call it. Or eFigs. eFigs is typical, and then Portuguese, Polish, and then later Russian, Korean, Japanese, and simplifies Chinese. So very wide reach. This shows you how the team structure worked. We did enter production in pandemic. So our pre-production we did before the pandemic and lockdown, and then we entered production, and this is kind of what it looked like. So most of the people on the team were on the West Coast. Some of them were up in Seattle. Most of us were down in Southern California. We had a few people in the American Midwest and Texas, and then we had a few people in Europe. And we figured it out. I would like to talk about the art style because it's very striking and should be talked about. I had an idea, and the idea was very simple, is I want to take the art style of the late medieval period and merge it with the art style of the early modern period. So taking late medieval paintings, often done by Flemish or Burgundian, and I know that's a very messy set of terms there because the borders were shifting a lot. But anyway, Flemish, Burgundian painters, and then early modern woodcuts, which were primarily in the Holy Roman Empire, Germany, Switzerland, etc. So the idea of merging these two with their individual characteristics into one coherent art style was the job of Hannah Kennedy, who is my art director. She is amazing. She's extremely analytical. She broke down each art style, you know, piece by piece. Like in the paintings, we will have white that gets applied on top of color. That does not happen in woodcuts, or at least almost never happens. Dark outlines are used in the woodcuts. They are not typically used in the paintings, things like that. So she would isolate these things and then reconcile them in a single art style. We were also influenced by Cartoon Saloon. This is an Irish and French film production house. They made a movie called The Secret of Kells, which I highly recommend. But it's stylized in such a way where it evokes the feeling of Irish illuminated manuscripts, but it doesn't actually do that art style. So we tried to find a way to make something that felt fresh and new while evoking the style that we were referencing. And just to say it, there were also, in addition to the general artistic concerns, many practical concerns. Our characters walk on a single plane, they kind of walk on a single track, and so a lot of our art style, how we compose scenes, was driven by the needs of the game. The game is a very simple game. We want it to be playable by people who don't normally play games, so the art style was constructed to make it very easy to navigate the space. To talk about the music a little bit. So I got in touch with an early music ensemble called Alchemy through an old classmate of mine. Never forget your old classmates. There are so many people that I went to school with. Even though I dropped out of music school, I still kept in touch with a lot of my former classmates. So Carrie Shaw is a fantastic soprano. She had been in a number of small ensembles, and she had worked with Alchemy, and Alchemy just does early music. They just do largely late medieval, early Renaissance stuff. During the pandemic, they had difficulties, like any performers, because they're a performing ensemble and they couldn't really perform live. They also couldn't perform together because of concerns of sickness, but that's how they rehearsed. But they worked through it. I think it turned out great. Initially, the scope was literally just 16th century German music. That is a really narrow scope. And they were really struggling with it. And I'm like, oh no, like let's go back, let's go out, let's find some other stuff. So in the end, almost all the music in the game was pulled from 14th to 16th century sources, German, French, or Italian. There were some original compositions that they made, which I think fit beautifully, but a lot of it was based on or inspired by historical music and played using historical instruments. They were really fantastic to collaborate with. Can't speak highly of them enough. There was one exception. There was one song, which was the ending track, Ein Traum, which was performed by Kristen Hayter, pulled from a 19th century poem. And that music was intended to sound different from everything else without spoiling the end of the game. It wanted to feel like it was kind of out of time, like that experience was not connected to the rest of the game in a way. She was also amazing to work with. She was incredible. And as a splurge, we had vinyl art done for the album by Benjamin Vierling, which was fantastic. So he practices mish technique. So he uses egg tempera and oil. It took him, I want to say 18 months total to complete the painting because he does it in very thin layers that have to dry over a long period of time. And it's now hanging at Obsidian, and it's incredible and amazing. And it was kind of a ridiculous expense, but it looks awesome. By the way, it's coming back. The vinyl is coming back. We're gonna have a third run. It's coming. So it's sold out both times because people didn't believe in it. There were people that didn't think that a vinyl would sell, so it's sold out twice, but it is coming back. So now it's time to talk about the fonts. I'm gonna deep dive on this, so get ready. The main goal I had originally is I wanted to convey the physicality of writing. I wanted you to feel like the act of writing was actually happening on the screen. That was as simple as it started, but I did also have this idea of it writing out in real time. I remember years ago, my girlfriend at the time, I explained this idea, she's like, that sounds unbearable. That sounds unbearable. I'm like, I hear what you're saying, but I think we can do it. And it took a long time. It was, in fact, the fonts were the biggest investment of resources on the project in terms of time and money. So we were heavily inspired by, of course, historical bookhands, also like casual letter writing hands and typefaces. Initially, I had found the website of a Swiss typographer who did very accurate historical fonts from text, and they were very cool. They probably would not have been legible or really readable to a modern reader, but they were very cool and they were very historical, and so that didn't quite work out. So then I just went on Twitter and was like, hey, anybody who makes fonts? Want to make fonts for a game? And Riley Cran, out of nowhere, said, yeah, hit me up. So I started talking to Riley, and he, I can't remember if he owns the company, but he's the head of a company called Lettermatic. And Lettermatic, all they do, they're typographers, they develop fonts. I wasn't expecting to do this, but in the end we had 6 custom fonts. They're purely out of nothing. They're not based on existing fonts or anything. They were just made from scratch, obviously inspired by historical sources. I do think in the end, I don't think there's another game that has ever done this. I mean, there are games that get custom fonts, but 6, I don't think that's ever happened. We really went overboard with this stuff. Primarily what fonts do in the game is they are indicators of education or indirectly class, although that wasn't the conception at the time. So when you talk to a character, Andreas, it's his perception of who they are and what their background is. So when he talks to someone who's a peasant, their script appears as a peasant script. However, sometimes Andreas's perception of that character will change. His understanding of their education will change, and when it does, so does their font. This character is Till Kreutzer, and Till is a dutiful shepherd in the field, and on one night you can talk to Till and you find out that actually he's read a lot of books, and this happens. So his very simple peasant script gets replaced with a more fanciful cursive script. This happens, I want to say, 6 or 7 times throughout the game. We don't explain it, but we just hope that the player picks up on it over time, and they always do. And sometimes it's shocking, and sometimes it's just an interesting footnote. But this is how we achieved voice, because we don't have voice acting. And why the reason for that is not artistic as much as it is, that would have been so expensive, because we have over 100 characters. This is typically how we associated the fonts. Textura fonts, or the Textura font, is typically used for educated monastics. These are people who are typically high-born, either middle class or upper class. They are aristocrats. They work in the scriptorium or the library, and they are kind of from the old tradition. So Father Garnet, Sister Illuminata, Guy, all of these characters use the Textura font. The humanist font is typically used by people who are university educated or close enough. For example, Jakob Estler, the archdeacon, also uses the humanist font. In a way, this is to show a level of education that is similar to Andreas's, because Andreas is also university educated. The cursive font was used for the educated townsfolk. Originally, we were going to stop here. We were going to say, okay, we're ending with cursive, but then we had, Father Thomas, who's the town priest, used it. The miller used it. But then you had farmers, really rough and tumble people, and people said, the cursive font just kind of feels too fancy for them. So then we made peasant cursive, which was just simpler. The letter forms were simpler, they looked less practiced. We wanted it to be legible, but clearly look rougher. This is a very difficult balancing act, but I think the team pulled it off very well. Printed, so we did realize, well, we have printers, so we should have a printed font, and it had its own special features. So the printers, and there's one character who just reads a lot of printed books, and his font changes over to printed. And then finally, the thread puller. And I'm not going to spoil it, but if you know, you know. The fanciest font. I did want to dive a little bit technically into this. I hope this is not boring. But one of the really notable things about the game is that every letter draws in stroke by stroke. And to do this, we experimented for a very long time and settled on this thing called stroke masks. You can see how the words come in at the top. That's Brother Piero. We've slowed it down so that you can see each stroke come in line by line. Every glyph, which is not necessarily an individual letter, it can also be a combination of letters, such as the combination in the lower right. Every glyph in a bookhand has between 1 and 8 strokes that makes it up. Strokes occur in a specific order. Strokes are also directional, but they're not just directional, they also follow a specific path. It's not just left to right, it can sometimes come back on itself. Also, the order of the strokes is not intuitive. So as regular old people who are not typographers, we assumed, oh, you would write this letter in this order. And then the people who are calligraphers said, stop. You're thinking of doing it with a ballpoint pen. If you were doing this with a quill, this is the order that you would do it in, because it physically is very different. If you go against the nib, it will stutter and it'll just be a big mess. So they actually gave us all of this information, this ductus information that showed us the order and direction of every single stroke, which then we had to manually make masks for. So there were over, I think, 2,800 stroke masks that we had to make. Those were all done by hand by 2 members of the team, to whom I'm forever grateful. But it was an incredible manual process to get everything to draw out in this way. I did also want to mention sometimes strokes overlap. This is very common. We maintained this because the letters might look opaque, but they're not actually opaque. There is a level of transparency to them, and when the strokes overlap, you can see the different levels of opacity where they overlap. And we have a number of other bookhand font features that make this all come together. For one thing, characters do make errors. Different characters have different error rates. So more educated characters are ones that are renowned for being very precise. They have very few errors. Ones that are not have more errors, and then they get corrected in real time. This was very common with scribes because it's a very labor-intensive process. If you made a mistake, you're on parchment, so you can scrape off the ink and redo it, and that's how we represented it. Speed was also variable. Characters like Brother Guy, who is renowned as the fastest scribe in the Abbey, he actually talks quite fast. Brother Folkbert, who is not quite so quick, his text comes in much slower. Ink wetness and drying. So again, to capture the physicality of it, it's a little difficult to see on the projector, but when the ink comes in, it's very dark, and there's also a highlight to show where the actual physical shape of the ink is before it gets absorbed into the parchment. And then as it dries, it gets smaller, and it bleeds. So as parchment absorbs ink, it spreads beneath the surface, and you get a halo effect, which we implemented. And then finally, we do have something for the cursive font specifically, because cursive is supposed to be a continuous hand. It's not something broken up by lots and lots of different strokes. But the way that we represented that is that on the first letter of every sentence or every line, it's overloaded. The pen is overloaded with ink, and so it bleeds outside of the boundaries of the letter form. As you continue writing, it contracts into the edges of the letter, and it starts to become translucent. And then when it, quote unquote, runs out of ink, the pen, it stops drawing for a second, or not a second, but like a fraction of a second, and then it dips again, and you see it get dark. And this was to convey what we see in a lot of letters that people wrote is, this is how you write things with a pen. You dip it, and you write until you run out of ink. And then there's also a really minor thing, which is that we did have variant forms for certain things, like the cursive hand. A lot of characters used cursive, so we could set variants so that their specific form of cursive looked different from other characters. And then in one particular case, Brother Guy, because he is a Burgundian scribe, his Y's actually point in a different direction. This was like a very specific special thing we did for a plot point, but Lettermatic supported it, so it was great. And to see all of these things in action at larger scale, this is Brother Guy. So you can see the ink and the bleeding and the error correction. And these are all very subtle things, and individually they sound stupid. Like, why would you do this? But when they're all taken together, the effect, I think, is pretty significant. So now let's talk about the last font, which is not covered by anything that I previously discussed, which is the printed font. The printed font was inspired by Nicolas Jensen's typeface. Nicolas Jensen was a French typographer in the 15th century, and he developed something that we're still using today. If you can go look up Adobe Jensen, it looks almost exactly like the typeface he made back then, which I find quite striking. I think it's amazing that we can have this in use and it's still so readable after all this time by a modern audience. In World, we decided that this typeface was actually invented by Marie Druckeren. Can't remember the name of my own character. Marie Druckeren, who is the wife of the printer. And so we had one of the members, Heather Cran, on the Lettermatic team, develop this typeface based on Jensen, but she included little fanciful details such as the stars over the eyes. I'm very happy with how it came out. Whenever a character who uses print speaks the first line in a scene, they will fill in letter forms. You can see on the left there, that is filled in like a letter form. Letter forms would be filled in, upside down and left to right, which is how you would fill it, and then it gets inked and it pushes into the screen. So the dialogue bubble pushes back and you hear a sound like a press operating. And we also implemented voids and bleeds. So voids are places where the letter forms are not inked enough, and you get gaps. You can see it in the word were on the bottom. There are gaps there because the letters weren't inked well enough, and also bleeds, which is the opposite problem, where you've put too much ink and it bleeds out of the expanse. Now, Klaus is a good enough printer that he wouldn't do this, but to convey, again, the physicality of writing, we put that in. I did want to talk about how we established the writing style and the voices for the game. Because the 16th century is something that in some ways is very alien to us. I really like the Cadfael shows. So Cadfael is a book series about an 11th century Welsh monk who solves mysteries. And they're quite charming. And there are a number of BBC movies starring Derek Jacobi, and they're great. I recommend them. But I watched a behind the scenes interview with Derek Jacobi, and he said they made a conscious choice to keep the language feeling contemporary. Not so contemporary that it's jarring, like people saying, "Cool job, Cadfael," but to not make it feel archaic, to not make it feel stilted. They wanted it to be accessible because the subject matter in a lot of cases is very alienating. You're learning about a lot of things that you don't have experience with. So if the voices of the characters are also hard to parse, it makes it very difficult to engage with the subject matter. And I also remembered this very cool quote. There's a film called The Mill and the Cross. The Mill and the Cross is sort of an adaptation of a large book that is an interpretation of Bruegel the Elder's The Way to Calvary, or The Procession to Calvary, which is in the Kunsthistorisches Museum, and I got to see, and I was so happy. But Rutger Hauer of Blade Runner fame plays Bruegel the Elder, and he says, "My painting must be big enough to hold everything, everyone, all of the people." And it really made me think about how this painting encompasses all of society. And when we talked about the cast size of our game and all the different types of people it would represent, I thought of that and like, I want to show everyone. I want to show peasants, I want to show Romani, I want to show, all sorts of people from every part of society. And to do that, I felt like we needed to make the voices very distinctive. And to do that, we needed to kind of bring it forward in time and make it feel more contemporary. When we wrote the characters, we just kind of naturally gravitated towards the things that we were good at. So my main writing partner, Kate Dollarhide, she's very funny, and so she wrote a lot of the peasants, and it worked great. I have a background, obviously, in history, but also theology, so I wrote most of the very deeply religious characters, or things about magic, because that was part of my studies as well. Zoe Franznick, who is a Latinist, she focused on Latin and Roman culture. And then Merton Radisep had a background in philosophy, so he dealt with some of the more philosophical aspects in the game. Also, there were certain things that I did consciously to kind of echo constructions in German. I don't speak German natively, I speak it okay, but there were certain constructions about like until later or whatever that are colloquial, so that when it was translated into German, it would feel, again, sort of more contemporary and not quite so stilted and dated. Representing religion in any setting is very difficult. Just to be honest, a lot of game developers don't like religion as a subject. One, because it's something that they're not super familiar with, but another part of it is that they're very afraid of getting something wrong or upsetting someone. And that's very reasonable, I get why that is, but I wanted to do it. I had done it before in an expansion for Fallout called Honest Hearts, which has a lot of problems, honestly, but I wanted to work on something where religion was sort of tackled more seriously again. Now, one of the things that sort of comes up is, what did people actually believe? And we can't know that, right? Like, we can't know the interior thoughts of any other human being, but we do know what people write down about themselves and about other people. So there were certain things that did inspire me in approaching this. One was the Frenay Register. This is a compilation of basically the Inquisition from Jacques Fournier. Jacques Fournier was an inquisitor in what is now southern France. After the Albigensian Crusade, he eventually became Pope Benedict XII, and he would interrogate people about their beliefs because they were Cathars, and he was trying to bring them back into the fold of Catholicism. And they believed all sorts of things, like really complex things, and they were not afraid to tell him that they thought that the church was wrong and that their beliefs about the Green Man and changelings were correct. So that was quite interesting to just read those accounts where they have the ability to form ideas on their own, even peasants. Another one that's especially notable is Minocchio, who is an Italian miller featured in Carlo Ginzburg's microhistory study, The Cheese and the Worms. Minocchio is an Italian miller who received education at a young age and was able to read. And he read all sorts of things, and he would not shut up. He would not stop talking about his very weird, very heretical beliefs to his neighbors. And his beliefs were so heretical that he was tried 3 times. And the first 2 times they said, stop talking to people about these things. 1, go to church, stop saying this stuff. Most importantly, stop telling your neighbors because you're aggravating them. And he couldn't stop. So in the 3rd try, he was not actually condemned for heresy, he was condemned for being the founder of a heretical movement because his beliefs were so weird. The title, The Cheese and the Worms, he believed that the angels were worms that chewed through this form that the earth was made of cheese, and the angels ate through the earth, and that formed the elements. Duh. So all of this is to say people believed a lot of things. People were capable, even at low education levels, or people who you wouldn't expect to be educated, could form complex interior thoughts. And that translates into people having a lot of different levels of, a lot of different beliefs and a lot of different levels of devotion. So you can have a very pious monk, you can have a nun that hates the fact that she was sent away to an abbey, you can have a Romani tinker who is basically a Gnostic, who is, yeah, he has a lot of weird beliefs, and a full spectrum, and that's the way that we approached just a broad spectrum of this stuff. To talk briefly about books and bookmaking, because it's relevant, just to say it, monastic scriptoria are anachronistic in the 16th century. Probably none existed. When I talked to Christopher de Hamel, who was one of our academics on call for the game, he was like, yeah, those were pretty much gone. He said a lot, like making books by hand was only at this point really deluxe manuscripts. These are the very high-end ones. And they were typically made by either guilds or individual artists that were, very established, but they were secular. They were not at abbeys. But we made it part of the plot. We said that Kiersau Abbey was a place out of time. It was holding on to this practice through a small number of patrons that still were like, yeah, we'll throw you a bone. You can make a cool deluxe manuscript for us. In the course of making the game, we had to reference lots of stuff online. One, we didn't really have the credentials to just bust into the Huntington Library and say like, show me Wound Man. But also we were under lockdown, so we couldn't really travel, and certainly we weren't going to get manuscripts transported to us. So using online resources and scans was very, very helpful to us. I'm very glad that universities are digitizing all of this stuff. It makes it so much easier for people who want to see it. We also did buy some facsimiles, such as the Nuremberg Chronicle, which I believe is right here, and also on the wall. But the Nuremberg Chronicle is one huge, and it has tons of art that we used as reference for developing our art style. Hannah bought a huge facsimile of it and looked through it extensively, which was great. We also visited the Getty. The Getty Museum is in Los Angeles. It's an hour north of us. They have an enormous collection of manuscripts and exhibits. So as soon as the pandemic started to lift a little bit, we took a field trip. And a lot of members of the team were shocked. They were like, they're so small. We were looking at bestiaries, and some of them were, like that big. But seeing the physicality of the pages, how gold leaf kind of shapes to the gum that it sticks to and reflects light as the page bends, all that stuff was very, very fascinating to the team. The sources that we used. We do have a bibliography in the game if you want to look at the credits. It started with my personal library. I kept everything from college because I like history. And good old JSTOR. So I've discovered that you can log into JSTOR with your Google account. You don't have to be an academic. And I was like, oh, good, because I am not an academic. And I found tons of articles through JSTOR, extremely helpful. I also supplemented my library. There were certain things where I couldn't find them in an online form. So, for example, I remember Jutta Berger is a German academic who in 1999 published a book on hospitality among German Cistercians in the 16th century. And that book was hard to get, and then once I got it, I could barely read it because the academic language was so rough. But I got it, that's the important thing, and I got the information I needed. So we supplemented over time, and then we did have 4 academics that helped us with various tricky things, because again, I'm a game developer. I like history, but I'm not an expert. So the first was Dr. Christopher de Hamel. If you know about manuscripts, you've probably heard of Christopher de Hamel. He's written several books on the subject. He was very instrumental in sort of saying, no, there wouldn't be monastic scriptoria, but maybe you could do this or do that. Figuring out the potential ideas for Andreas's educational background and how he would have gotten a university education, which would have been difficult. Dr. Edmund Kern was my advisor in college, and because there's very direct overlap with what I studied, he was very useful, especially for things like legal proceedings, how an execution would be conducted. Legal stuff in this time period was a big mess, so he was incredibly helpful. Winston Black was a classmate of mine. He went the other way. I went into goofball stuff, and he became a serious academic. And he studies medieval medicine, which, even though we're in the early modern period, a lot of the medicines stayed medieval, or rather ancient, for a long time, which became a topic in the game. So he was very helpful with that. And finally, a classmate of mine who was a classicist, Magistra Heather Nabafeld. So she is a teacher at Boston Latin School, and we have a lot of Latin text in the game. We have a huge, huge amount of Latin text in the game. I was actually mentioning that the margins, when you go into the margins to look at glossary entries, there's Latin that's written in there. That's all original Latin that Zoe Franznik or Heather wrote it tells the story of what's happening in the game. So if you actually zoom out and start reading it, it's not nonsense. It's actually telling you, the abbot said that Andreas could do it, and you're like, oh, okay. So she was extremely helpful for spot checking stuff and fixing errors and things like that. I will say I committed certain archaeological sins. I'll try not to be too spoilery here, because this gets into spoiler territory, but just to admit to certain things. There's no statues of Mars with the name on the helmet. Just none, ever. It was very important for a plot point, though, so I did it. There is no Mithraeum quite like Tassing's in terms of how it's illustrated and how it's laid out. However, I would say that there is liturgical evidence that because of how gods are referenced within the liturgy of Mithras, that it is not impossible, let's say, that they could be illustrated in a certain Mithras is better than you way. So I feel fine with that. And then finally, the creative license to litter the salt mines with pagan artifacts. Would they just be lying around? No. We actually talked about having a separate scene where you would go and look through artifacts, but we're like, we're running out of time. Let's just put them in the salt mine. It worked out. So I admit, mea culpa. There are some historical gray areas I wanted to talk about because I think this is an interesting subject. Maybe, I don't know, it's just interesting to me. So there are a few subjects that we deal with: Perchta and the Wild Hunt, the Perchtenlauf, and also St. John's Eve and how it's represented in the game. So a lot of the references that we see in texts to this appear around the 18th or the 19th century and not much earlier. But the thing is, a lot of these were rural practices. So absence of evidence is, or absence of evidence, evidence of absence. Basically, just because we don't have records doesn't mean that people didn't believe things or practice things, and also those things probably just not appear ex nihilo, like they came out of something. Also very commonly, individual communities would have their own traditions that were not necessarily like the traditions of even their neighbors. These were very isolated communities. So even though these are relatively modern in the grand scheme of things, the idea of Perchta, how she is incorporated into the Wild Hunt in Tassing, how the Perchtenlauf is represented, those are not meant to represent, like, this is how things were in Bavaria and Austria all the time. This is just supposed to be this community. So there you go. I do think it's interesting when we have sort of a broken tradition and no records to sort of try to imagine how these communities might have conducted themselves prior to the records coming into existence. So I want to talk about historical art and history in games, wrapping this all up. I always believe that we can make a historical game. I think historical games are cool. I think historical art is cool, obviously. I do think there's room for a lot of different interpretations of it. I pick something that is historical fiction based in a historical context. I also think you can do something that's more straight history, retelling specific events. And I think you can do historical fantasy where you incorporate fantastic elements into history. That's all really cool. I think we can make all sorts of games like this. I think we can have realistic games. If you've ever seen Kingdom Come Deliverance by the Bohemian, well, I shouldn't say Bohemian studio, the Czech studio. I mean, but they take a very realistic approach. They are going for hyper-realism. It's very beautiful. They're very fastidious in how they research things. Obviously, I went for something stylized. Part of that's because it's a small team, but I think there's a lot of room for different interpretations. I think it works for big games and little games. Assassin's Creed, I mean, it plays real loose with, I can't remember, is John F. Kennedy an assassin or a Templar? But the point is, there's a historical foundation there, and those are big games. So I think it can work for big games. I think it can work for little games. I wouldn't say that something like Pentiment would ever be a big game because it is very, you're gonna read. You're gonna do a lot of reading, not a lot of assassinating. In fact, zero. So I do think you have to tailor the type of game to the audience, but I think it can work for a wide spectrum. And I do want to see more collaboration, not just on historical games, but more collaboration between academics and developers because one, every academic I talked to, whether we hired them on or not, was very enthusiastic about talking about their specific subject matter. When we paid them, they were thrilled. And yeah, like we all have limitations to our knowledge. I love history, but I am a game developer. So it was very helpful to me and the team to be able to incorporate their expertise into our game, and I think it made it better in the end. Thank you very much.
for the many, many insights you've given us into the making of this game. I was wondering, since everything does, first of all, if you're curious about the cheese and the worms, we have that book here, just so, because that might be a thing you might want to read up on. But in terms of everything really being in the details with this game, and especially in the connection with the art, I guess, I was wondering, is that combination of having design have such also an emotional purpose and a storytelling purpose, is that something that you've seen in games you've made previously as well? Is that something that's just important to you in general, or particularly with this one?
I would say more so in this one, having an emotional connection to the characters and what's happening. So I would say, without getting too lost in the weeds here, a lot of the previous games I worked on, the character is a blank slate. So we can't assume kind of background or emotional intention or anything like that, and it makes it very difficult to kind of make emotional scenes, really. And with Pentiment, I knew from the beginning that I wanted a fairly tightly defined character. Andreas is not just a guy. Like, he's an artist from Nuremberg. He has a dad. He's gonna get married to this lady. He went to university. So it's a very specific set of constraints, but allowed us to tell a more, I think, emotionally engaging story. The reason why I felt it was more important is because, going back to that thing where people have bad experiences with history, it's very dry. So a lot of people's experience academically, especially in, sort of early education, is that they learn dates and events and names, and they're like, bah, 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 bah. Like, it's not engaging. So I felt like it was very important that the story and the characters in Pentiment really gripped you and you felt very close to them, that the community felt very tight-knit, more so than in other games, because there is that apprehension about, oh, history, like, God, this is so boring. I'm like, no, please. Like this guy, please.
And in terms of the experience, or because it speaks so much to the experience of being an artist as well, would you say that 16th century painter and a game developer today have some commonalities?
Maybe a little bit. The fickleness of patrons, maybe. Just looking at the game industry right now. No, it's interesting because there are certain attitudes expressed by Brother Piero is like the most forward-thinking monastic artist ever, because he's expressing ideas about art that are not medieval or even early modern. They're actually they're more 19th or 20th century. The sort of passion for art and this more deeper examination. It was largely craft focused for most people. So, which isn't to say that they couldn't be passionate about it, but it didn't have the same idea of like art then as it does maybe now. But I will say that I did pull from my own experiences as a game developer to sort of convey some of that frustration or disillusionment. I think I told you, like, we did win a second award, but we were nominated for a bunch of awards. The only one we won at first was the Game Developer's Choice Narrative Award, which I was very honored about. But then I realized it's because all game developers eventually become Act 2 Andreas. Like, we all kind of just become like, yep, still doing this. Not happy about it, but we're doing it. But yeah, so there were certain elements that I pulled from for that, but I wouldn't say probably in reality that Durer's experience is my experience. Yeah, who can know the interior mind of Albrecht Dürer?
But I guess also in terms of history playing into maybe the game structurally, I'd be curious to know, like, because there's this big thing in the game, maybe most of you know about it, but like, if you make one or the other decision, sometimes sometimes dreaded by me, this will be remembered, yes, comes up on the screen with, is it a bell or a chime or some sort of gong? Or,
yeah, something like that.
It feels intense and it stresses you out at first. What I found really interesting about it is that in most games, most of the time, you kind of have an inkling of where decisions go that you make. Whereas I feel like in Pentiment, that's kind of completely thrown out of the window. The idea of knowing that maybe just an aside or something you say in a moment could have this or the other consequence seems very, in the sense of like life or death, historical decisions. It's
so I've worked on a lot of games that do branching narrative and choice and consequence, and something I wanted to do for this game is I wanted the aggregation of lots of little decisions to play out over time, and for the player to not know when those things were going to be noticed, and to kind of put you on edge. Like, I think there's a lot of games, including ones I've worked on, where you get into a dialogue and you can kind of be like, yep, whatever, say anything, where am I getting to, option, great, okay, now I want to do this and decide on the quest. But playing Disco Elysium, great game, if you haven't played it, I highly recommend it. But Disco Elysium does these little micro adjustments to checks that you make. And so, for example, Kuno, depending on how you talk to Kuno, when you try to make checks with him, they will play out in different ways. And I was like, that's a really cool idea. I don't want to use the dice, but I do want to use that mechanic. And I also want to play it out over a longer period of time. So when you first start seeing it, we try to set it early with Clara, with Martin, and the stakes are pretty low, but the player starts to go like, what, why are you paying attention to that? Why does that matter? We're like, I don't know, just stick around and find out. And sometimes it's fairly inconsequential, like Martin, I think, is the first one where it's get Martin to greet you nicely in the field. Most people fail that, and he says, eat shit, Andreas, and he runs off. But it shows you like, oh, and it says like you talked to him like this, and then you insulted him, but then you apologized. And so it shows like, hey, the way you talk to people, they're gonna respond to it, and it might not play out immediately, but it will play out. And the idea there was to get players to just look at what they were picking a little more, and also to, because we don't have the save system is just a rolling save, so you can't go back and pick other things, and especially not if they're hours ago. So it was a way of saying, this is all gonna work out, but you're not going to be happy with everything. Right. Yeah. Like there's a lot of things where you're going to go like, God, I wish I didn't do that. And you're like, oh, but the story keeps going. Yeah. It's going to keep going, and that's life. Right. So it is, and it's a historical parallel. I would say that you can't save and go back and do stuff over. This is historically accurate. In the 16th century, you could not save anything. Nope. But in terms of the murder mystery element, also you obviously read about the historical judicial system and stuff. Maybe you can talk to that a little bit, as in like, does that influence also how it feels, whether you can obtain justice or not? Absolutely. So, very briefly, there was a developer, this was years ago, who came to pitch a game for us to co-develop, and it was a murder mystery, and it sounded pretty boring. And part of it was that it was a very traditional sort of thing, where it's like, there's one murderer, you're gonna figure it out, all paths lead to the end. And I was like, I get why some people like playing games like that, so I'm not trying to completely dismiss that, but I was thinking for a role-playing game company, I feel like the player has to have a little more struggle in making those decisions. And in a historical game, I mean, there weren't detectives in the 16th century. The way that the judicial system, such as it was, worked was very capricious. And I thought, what if the player never found out whether they were right or wrong? They just had evidence, and that they knew that they didn't have a full picture. So they're like, oh, I never got to talk to this guy, or like, I never got to go to the confession, like, what would I have found out there? And like, this guy sucks, but I don't really know if he did it. And this guy is probably more likely to have done it, but like, I like that guy. And there's this old woman and nobody likes her and she seems like she wants to die, so maybe I should just... But the thing is, I wanted the player to engage with that mentally. I wanted the player to realize, like, you're not gonna find real justice. You're gonna condemn someone to death and then you're gonna live with it. Yeah. And a lot of the structure was very alienating to people, like the idea of you have an archdeacon and you just come in and he's like, what's up? Tell me. You're like, is there someone gonna bang a gavel or and it's like, no, this is not the same. This is not what we understand as a modern trial. Right. And in fact, the sentence and everything gets pronounced way later. So it's somewhat alienating, it's somewhat confusing and frustrating. And it is, again, to sort of engage the player like, no, like you're really deciding this and you're not going to know. And then it's the game playing out over a long period of time where you come back 7 years later and characters are like, you piece of shit. And you're like, I didn't know that was going to happen. But that's the feeling we want to evoke. Is like you're put in a really difficult position and you're kind of forced out of it. Just as one other minor note, there's a great book I read called The Faithful Executioner by Joel F. Harrington. It's also here. Very good. We did our homework. It was research for the actual act of the execution, but the story in there is that the titular faithful executioner, Franz Schmidt, his family was forced into being executioners. So there was an uprising, and I can't remember if it was a duke or a baron, but basically he wanted justice, and he was like, execute these guys. And they're like, there's no executioner here. And so he pointed at Franz Schmidt's father, who was like a huntsman or like a woodsman, and said like, you're going to be the executioner. But that meant condemning him to like a life of like, ooh, like now you're a pariah. No, it's very dishonorable. But he was like, if you do not accept, I will find someone else and you will go on, you will be up to be executed as well. He's like, well, okay. But this ambiguity of like, how do I make a right decision? How do I know what's right? Being forced to make a decision that you don't want to make, I think was very important for the game.
Right. And one of my favorite aspects in the game are the dreams that Andreas is having. And I think, especially in terms of the artistic influences, those might be like big centerpieces or like showcases of how there's a lot of art influence in there. Why did you feel like it was important to have those internal parts to the narrative?
I think in the examination and figuring out like who you want to accuse, I thought there needed to be a dialogue where you actually went through all the pieces of evidence before you went to the archdeacon. And so what I felt was important is I need to have a dialogue, but who can I have this dialogue with? How about your own brain? And so, you know, again, this is a little bit of Disco Elysium inspiration where you have, you know, Prester John as sort of the ruler of your brain. And then you have Beatrice or Beatrice from the Divine Comedy, just to make that clear, that's where she's from. And then St. Grobian from the Ship of Fools and Socrates. And these are sort of different aspects of his mind and his personality. So as you talk through it, it kind of spells out the implications of all the evidence you found if you haven't put it together yourself. But then this is also a place to show the state of Andreas's mind. Right. In the first act, it's the city of reason, and it's a perfect Renaissance, symmetrical, beautiful. The way that the perspective is laid out is very Renaissance oriented. The city itself and how you navigate it is based on an ideal city layout, which was super popular, especially among Italians in the Renaissance, is laying out perfect cities. Pavlova, by the way, is one of these executed, which is a crazy, crazy city to read about the history of. But then in later acts, it sort of degenerates as his mental state degenerates, so it becomes a labyrinth, which has obviously ancient representation, but also Christian mystical representation, and then a maze. So these are just sort of checking in with Andreas's brain and how it's going wrong.
Speaking of maze, being in a library and the library being a maze, in especially The Name of the Rose, just to you, libraries as a literary motive, like why would you say that was a good place or like an inspiring place for these characters to be in, or also for you, research-wise, how did libraries factor into the making of this game?
Oh, that's a big question. I love art, I love books. I love how those come together in manuscripts because it is a craft really in that time, but they're, you know, and there are a lot of books that are manuscripts where like, slap it out, and the book hand is sloppy, the Latin is bad, there are errors anywhere, but then there are deluxe manuscripts or things like the Très Riche or the Duke of Berry, which are just so extraordinary and exquisite. And so it's the blending of, sometimes it's religious text, you know, Book of Hours, or sometimes it's a historical text, or sometimes it's a retelling of, you know, or it's the Aeneid, basically. But the combination of the artistic talent with the sort of historical or mythological or religious subject matter is just, I think, very cool. So seeing these things combined in that way, especially when it's all being done by hand, or even in print, especially with hand rubrication and all the wood carving, it's just really compelling to me. But then I think that idea of history and writing history being a part of what the themes of the game are, but also history is records of what's left behind, and so going back to the books as the source of this, and a missing book being a kind of a plot element throughout of it. So I think it all kind of just works together very well.
Cool. Now I'd like to open up the questions to the audience. Do we have one here? Yeah, I'll be jumping around, I guess.
Thank you. So I wanted to go back to the beginning of your talk when you said game developers were afraid of history. And I think you're certainly right. But at the same time, some of the earliest games for microcomputers were historical games. World War II, Napoleonic War, a ton about the American Civil War. But it was only these wars. So
yes,
maybe
you love war.
So they weren't afraid of historical wars, but they were maybe afraid of the historical civic life?
Yes, I think that's really it. I mean, yeah, guys will say they hate history and they can tell you everything that happened at Kursk and Battle of the Bulge and like all this other horse shit. Sorry, it's all interesting. Do we need another book about World War II? I don't think so. But wars are exciting, right? Like big figures are exciting. So you get things like great men of history, huge quotes around all of that, which was the prevailing approach to history for at least a century, before social history started kind of taking over. So yeah, I think there's certain things where it's like, tanks are cool. Reading about the Gotha 226 FE bomber is cool. Like, okay, I guess. But it's this kind of fetishization of military stuff and learning about that. That's exciting and interesting to people. But then when it's talking about, what did peasants eat? Or, you know, like what was the daily life of a monk? That stuff is probably less appealing. And also that's not stuff that's taught at a sort of like, you know, more elementary level of education. That's stuff that you learn when you start digging into it in upper education. So I do think, yes, like Call of Duty, people are like, yeah, fucking kick ass. But when it comes to the more nuanced sort of social stuff, that's usually where people are like, that sounds boring. I don't actually know anything about it. I don't want to do the research about it. I don't want to go on the, you know, like I can't go on the History Channel and watch 8 different specials about how, you know, Operation whatever played out in, you know, the Aegean Sea in World War II or whatever. So I think that's probably what it is.
Oh, can I just pass this on? Right, no, yeah, that's easy.
First of all, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Absolutely amazing. Wonderful. Really, really cool. And my question is, I think in a lot of regards, you're very, very right where the research is going, or is at the moment. I think there's a lot of things, a female printer, a lot of things that is only just now being looked at closer. So you're really, I wanted to say a German phrase and I don't know how to say it in English, but am Zahn der Zeit. But my question is, have you tried anything with schools, that you go into schools and play the game with kids and look at what you've talked about yourself, that the dry history lessons change, because I think this could do more heavy lifting than a lot of books or a lot of years of history lessons in school.
Thank you. I have not personally, but right after Pentiment came out, we were contacted by a number of academic institutions that wanted to incorporate it into their curriculum, or a variety of curricula. So whether that's something cross-disciplinary with game development or history or things like that, we do know that schools have used it. You know, it's not a short game, so it's not something you're just gonna breeze through, you know, it wasn't the intention primarily to use as a teaching aid, although through entertainment you do learn lots of stuff. But I have heard of classes that have used it, and hopefully it's useful to people. But yeah, it is kind of a long game for someone to be like, hey kid, play this over the weekend. Yeah, so I am happy when, if it is doing good, then I'm glad.
All right, maybe you could pass it on to the 2 people in the back there. Maybe the lady first.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. It's been fantastic.
Thank you.
Monasteries are a very common setting for historical fiction, especially medieval and early modern fiction. Name of the Rose has been mentioned. Did you ever consider a different setting for this game, or was that locked in from the beginning?
I mean, because the Name of the Rose was a big inspiration, I knew I wanted that to be part of it. However, I knew that I felt like having it be just in a monastery was going to be very limiting for a number of reasons. One, it's just guys. So double monasteries were something I started thinking about pretty early on, so I could represent 2 different religious communities united under one sort of common structure. So having more women be part of it, but also I just wanted to see more of society. So one of the ideas behind Andreas is that because he's a secular person, he's a secular artist, I mean, he's Catholic, obviously, but he's not part of the church community. He's being hired to do work. So he is able to bridge that gap between the secular world and the religious world. And that's why he kind of is this bridge between them and why he becomes so tangled up in everything. But the initial idea of a monastery, I knew I wanted to have something like that, and something that cleaves a little more towards old-fashioned. They're Benedictine, the OGs. So they're going to be a little more old-fashioned, but also, you know, just establishing this is an old-fashioned specific abbey. But then having the town associated with it, one, there were very often communities that were nearby, secular communities, so that allowed me to expand into other parts of society, even if some of them were slightly improbable, like, would there be a printer in the small town in the Alps? Probably not, but there's one anyway, so there you go.
So first of all, thank you very much from somebody who does not play video games, but loved Pentiment. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the translation process, because I think I've read about you saying, and it's true, that German translation is very, very good. Like just the language of the peasants and the way they speak with very much, and this is maybe a particularly Austrian thing, like a lot of translation into German is very Germany German.
Yes.
Whereas this, like, it's amazing.
I'm very glad. I can't really take much credit for that other than having an outsider's understanding of dialectical differences and things of that nature. So it's, we did work a little more closely with the German translation team for obvious reasons. One, I mean, German language RPG market is quite large, and also the subject matter. So we wanted to make sure that that stuff came across. And so we did have more discussions about, by the way, there's a character biography that we have. It's really brief, but it says where all the characters are from. So the translators had access to that. So, Sister Marguerite is from Krimmel, very, like out in the middle of nowhere. Other characters, like Father Garnet is from Munich. So the specificity of where people are from sort of contributed to that. And then, again, I think the fact that we did have a German translation team that sort of understood the necessity of it, they did a good job. Not that I would personally notice, because I did play through the entire game in German, but it's a Fremdsprache. Like, I don't know it as intuitively as people that speak it day to day and grew up speaking it. So thanks on behalf of not me.
And if I might just add a little follow-up, I assume the translation, though, was at a later stage than the art, because the one thing that I noticed is the letters, or the notes that Andreas finds have different text to what he reads out in German.
Yep.
So he reads something and it's not the same.
Yes, yeah, that's my fault. It will take no credit and all blame.
You said you didn't include voice acting in the game because of budgetary reasons. Do you think in hindsight that it would actually add to the game, because the game revolves so much around written text and reading text, and do you think it would detract from the theme or something?
I do think that voice could detract. Now, that being said, I do want to say that there is a very compelling argument to be made for accessibility. We did a lot to make the text more readable. We put a lot of font features, and you can scale the text, you can make easy read fonts, but I do remember I went to Gamescom and people were playing it live, and the response was very good, but I saw a guy in the line with the thickest glasses I've ever seen, and he was looking at his phone like this, and I was like, oh fuck, this is not gonna go well. And when he went up and he started playing the game, he was playing it like this close. And I want him to play the game, I want him to be able to play the game, and we did have text-to-speech and we had a lot of other features, but it still was hard for him. So there is a very compelling argument to me that voice acting is an accessibility issue, which I don't dispute at all. However, I do think it is contrary to what you said, which is the written word and the text itself is such an integral part of the experience of the game that, we have easy read fonts, and I do feel that playing in that mode does take certain things away from discovery of characters and voices, but it's necessary because some people can't read some of these fonts. It's very understandable. So I would rather have someone be able to play the game than not. Voice acting, though, like I said, the cost issue there was like huge, so kind of a non-starter. I will say, though, that if Microsoft decides in the future they want to add voice acting, I'm up for it.
Hello. Since we were already talking about commercial issues, I believe this game is commercial success for the company, or don't you have insight in that?
I don't really know.
Okay.
Just to not be super glib, but Xbox is very large, and Xbox has many, many companies, and Obsidian is one of them. And Obsidian, at the time that the team was formed, had over 250 employees. and Pentiment had 13. So in terms of like how important that is in the grand scheme of things was not like it wasn't a big deal. It was made to drive interest. Well, I shouldn't say this cynically. I made it because I wanted to make the game, but I also pitched it for Game Pass. And Game Pass and calculating like how much that translates to money, that's beyond me, and I personally don't care. But you know, it was a standout title for the platform, and Xbox was very happy about that. It got nominated for a bunch of awards. They were very happy about that. I was just happy to make it. So financially, that was not super relevant. I don't know where it is. I don't even know if I would be allowed to say if I did, but it wasn't a big concern at the time, which I'm very grateful. I'm lucky. I'm lucky that I'm part of a big company in this way.
What I was leading up to is when will we see Pentiment 2?
Oh, never.
Hey, thanks so much for the great talk. I really liked it.
Thank you.
I'm a game designer back in India, so I'm giving
Awesome.
you a straight game dev question. I'm really curious about like play testing. Like, how did you reach that point? Like, this is something special. This is something that will work for the idea that we have. Was there a prototype before, like the pitch or anything like that?
There
I'm
was.
really curious about
Yeah.
that process.
I breezed over it. I do have a talk, by the way. There's a couple of talks I have on YouTube. One is called Developing for Small Teams. It overlaps with some of the material here, but it's more focused for game development, like for devs, not for a general audience. So I might recommend looking at that because I go into more detail about what we did and how we approached it. But we did have a prototype. The prototype was just the Abbey, just the men's part of the Abbey. And it was a different murder. It was Brother Guy, because I said, I want to throw all this stuff away. I don't want to carry this over into the real game. I just want to do it as a proof of concept. So we had an art style. We didn't have lighting, but lighting is pretty minimal in this art style anyway. So we had the characters, animation, we had quest structure, dialogue, we had the murder trial in a very simplified format. And that was our proof of concept. It was like the core things of what we felt was necessary to like, does the art style work? Yes, it does. Does the animation style work? Yes. Scene loading and transitions in the book, having the pages turned, does that work? Does the mystery feel compelling? Is it interesting to investigate? And there were a lot of things we learned about that. And then we did scrap all of it, and we did the vertical slice, where we made essentially what was the real murder in Act 1, and then we built out from there. But that's how we approached it. And it's very important to me in development that you do have a prototype phase and you do have a vertical slice, and that establishes a very strong foundation, because if you don't have that, you're gonna pay for it for the rest of development. And by the way, I will say there was one thing that we didn't figure out in pre-production, which was how to handle the 3D scenes. So the intro with the book and the margins and how that all worked, I didn't figure that out. And it was a big mess. It was a big nightmare. We figured that out in production, and that was like the one big, it wasn't that big of a deal, but it was clearly like, we should have figured this out.
Thank you.
I was just curious, building up on, I think, your remark about the game incorporating various political themes in the sense that I really got the sense that you were really trying to show how women, minorities, people of color were part of these times and what their stories were. So I was just curious, what was the process for that like, and especially was there backlash from people? How was that reacted to?
So I believe that you choose every single thing that you put in the game. And every story that you tell is your choice. Like, you decide everything. Whether it's part of a historical record or not, you are making a conscious decision to tell a story or to exclude certain people from a story. And because Tassing is a fictional setting, and there weren't real historical events that happened in this place because it's fictitious, that gave me the flexibility to create a fictional narrative that embraced factual things, or rather recorded things about the time period. For example, there are records that there were Ethiopian priests at the Council of Constance. That was 100 years before the game takes place. So if they were around 100 years ago, there's a chance they could be here now. So Did I make up Brother Sebhat and his reason of returning a Bible? I sure did, because I'm the director and I can do that. But it also is true that, for example, St. Moritz was very, very popular in the Holy Roman Empire at this time. And in this period, he was always illustrated as a black African, like always, always. He was the patron of the emperor. Very, very popular saint. So the choice of including it is a conscious choice, but I didn't just make it up. That was a thing that was concurrent, and so I chose to include it. Also decisions to include a Romani character, although I don't think that Václav is really that indicative of Romani culture in general, but including him, including Jews, including, because the thing is, like, a character like Illuminata is very educated. She would be familiar with Christine de Paysan. And she was writing basically, not apologia, but she was basically saying the Romance of the Rose, that fucking sucks, and let me tell you why. And as a literate woman, she would have been aware of this. She would have known about it. So yes, like, I made choices to include these things because they were a part of this time. Every story you construct is deliberate choices, and these are the ones that I made. And I'm sure in some corner of the internet, people had backlash against it. Nobody on the team did. They all thought it was cool, and I was like, great, let's do it. So, yeah.
Hey, hello. Thank you for the talk. It was very inspirational, especially because it looks like there's a lot of passion in this project. And you also said that the idea was like 20 years old or something like that.
I mean, the general idea, yeah.
And maybe it will be a bit provocative, but when you make that, I guess, like dream game, and you put all that passion and all those topics you really wanted to like talk about, do you think it will affect your future work, that it will be like harder to work on the stuff that you're not that passionate about, for example?
Yes. However, what it does is galvanize me against working on stuff like that. Like, I'm not gonna do that. Like, which is a bold thing to say, but I don't know, I've been making games for 25 years, and I feel like I've worked on stuff where I'm not into it. And I've worked on stuff where I'm like, we gotta get this done, and I'm not feeling it, and this kind of sucks. And it's an awful feeling, and it shows in the final product. Like, the players can see, they're like, this is not that good. And working on Pentiment, it's not that every game needs to be that, like, oh my God, this is incredible. But one of the people I'm really inspired by, which might seem weird, but remember I went to music school originally, is Stephen Sondheim, the composer, the American composer. And there's a great HBO special called 6 by Sondheim, and he talks about making, it wasn't Company, there was some musical that he made where the pitch was, this is going to be easy, it's going to make a lot of money, and those were the reasons for making it. And he wasn't really into it, and he's like, it's the worst shit I ever made. But he's the one who said, if you don't love something, like, there's no reason to do anything if you don't love it. And that's also what Klaus says in the game, and that's what I'm saying right now. And that's a pretty high-minded thing to say when you gotta pay bills. But, if you're put in a situation where you're gonna get all the joy and passion for something crushed out of you because of the compromises you have to make, it does cause you to stop and question it. Sometimes you do have to make that decision and say, I have to live, I have to pay bills, and that's reality. For me, and I have done, I've crunched, I've done projects on very tight schedules. I'm too old. I can't do that anymore. So maybe I'll get kicked out of the industry, I don't know. But from my perspective, yes, it makes it harder, but it makes me look at things through the lens of, am I actually excited about this, and can I get other people excited about it? Because if I can't, it's not gonna be good.
Thank you for a great presentation and a really good game.
Thank you.
And keyword religion.
Yeah.
Have you received any feedback from any religious establishments on the game? Do you know if people there have played it, how they felt about it? What was the feedback?
So I have not received any feedback from, like, the Vatican. I did actually, though, I did an interview, I think it was like an hour-long interview with, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of it, but it's a Catholic gaming website. And they really liked the game. Like, they gave it a perfect score, I think. They were really complimentary, and it was because if I recall correctly, and forgive me if I paraphrase this incorrectly, but they basically said, this is not a game for people who are new to the faith. This is not a game for people who don't have an established sort of foundation of belief. But what they liked about it in the review is that it dealt with this maturely, and there were very devout people, and they practice their faith and their vocation in a way that feels very true to Catholicism. And there are people that don't, and that's people sin and they err, and sometimes they do it intentionally and sometimes they stumble. Characters like Matilda, who struggles with her vocation. She loves serving God, but she has difficulty with chastity, and that's a thing. And so at least this community, they really liked the approach because it felt serious without being condescending. It also didn't whitewash things. So I was glad, I was very happy, because I'm not religious by upbringing or in practice. But I did try to treat it seriously and maturely because I felt it deserved it. So maybe I'll get a letter from the Pope one of these days. But until then, I'm pretty happy with how it was received.
So I wanted to ask how you went about writing the characters in the game, because it's such a unique setting, and how you went about making the characters feel real and compelling and making people relate to them.
Thank you. So I was actually pretty happy when I saw this interview after the fact with Umberto Eco, where he said that when he started Name of the Rose, he wrote a list of monks. That was the first thing he did. He just made a list of monks' names and thought about how they related to what their positions in the abbey were. And that's kind of how I started with our story, is that I knew Andreas, and then I was like, let me make a list of monks and a list of nuns and their jobs in the abbey and where they're each from and their kind of general attitude. I knew Sister Zdena was highborn but really hated being in the abbey. Sister Illuminata is very highborn but very dedicated to her faith and very educated. So it would include details like that, but they were pretty thin. And then I started doing the town, and so figuring out all the families and their family trees, including ones where there was, let's say, questionable parentage of certain people, and how that influenced characters' relationships to each other. And it was really at the foundation, because I knew that if the community didn't feel connected and real, that it just wouldn't work. Because the whole story is really about Tassing and Kiersau, and how they're two interconnected communities. And so the first part of that was really just building all of that stuff and figuring out those relationships. And then the voice came out of the actual day-to-day writing. So, figuring out Illuminata took a while. Figuring out a character like Wojslav, he's a very sort of more down-to-earth character. So it happened over time. And sometimes we'd have different writers contributing to a single character, and we'd have to course correct where, in Act 1, someone wrote Lucky, and then in Act 2, Lucky suddenly becomes much more verbose. And we're like, no. Lucky's a smart guy, but he doesn't speak more than 3 words in a sentence. So that was kind of the iteration process. And it was also, like I said, about finding the strengths of the individual writers. So Kate is a very funny writer, and so she wrote a lot of the more peasant-oriented characters. And again, because I focused a lot on religion, I wrote characters like Piero and Illuminata, and Amelie. I wrote all of Amelie's dialogue as well. So that was kind of the process behind it.
First of all, thank you. I was wondering, since you mentioned earlier that video game developers felt hesitant to incorporate academic and historical details into their games, do you think that the rise of independent game developers and small-scale projects becoming more financially feasible, do you think that this may have an impact on video games just incorporating more historical elements in the near future?
I absolutely do, although the economic viability of games overall right now is very questionable. However, I will say that I do think that because ever since digital distribution became the norm for games, it has shifted how teams can form and make games and distribute them. There are upsides to this and there are downsides to this. I think one of the downsides is that every year more and more games are coming out. Like if you look at the number of new games released on Steam every year, it's gone up like, I'm not going to throw out random numbers, but it's crazy. So it's very hard to get people to notice that your game even exists. So that's a struggle. But the upside is that there's a much greater chance that a team can make a game, and they can make a game with a unique point of view. And if you think that Pentiment has a unique point of view, holy shit. Steam has some of the craziest games you've ever seen, and some of them are not good, but they are extremely unique and they're extremely expressive, and for that reason, they have value and interest. So I do think that if you get into something like more niche history, more niche areas, if it's a small team and a small project, I certainly believe that the current landscape, or well, let's maybe wait a year until funding comes back, but the current landscape is more amenable to the idea of people making passion projects about cultures, periods of history. I was in Tunisia, and I was walking around, and some people were saying like, oh, is this research for like Pentiment 2, but set in North Africa? And I said, I think that Middle Eastern North African culture in this time period of the stuff that I was looking at is fascinating. I'm not the person to do that. Like, I'll appreciate it, I'll play it, but I'm sure that there are people from that culture, or at least more connected to that culture, who can do a better service to it. So I certainly think that there's a possibility for more of this stuff in the future.
Okay, I think maybe first person not on the gallery yet, and then we'll move on the gallery.
Going back to Sondheim for a second, if you had to make a Pentiment-style game, but as a director following a playwright and a lyricist throughout their body of work, who would you pick?
I don't know. I'm gonna have to think about that. I would say Sondheim probably, just because I'm most familiar with the body of work. Yeah, I'm a little taken aback by the question. I don't think I can answer it coherently. But Sondheim is the lyricist and composer that I'm most familiar with, and I think that there's such a variety to the shows that he does, and there's such a maturity to the development of characters. I think that I gotta go for my boy.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you.
A quick question. I know this must be annoying to you, but there's not a single time you might get away without talking about Fallout New Vegas. Because you mentioned earlier that Honest Hearts was your first foray, or serious foray, into the theme of religion.
Mm-hmm.
But I've also noticed a lot of the themes in Fallout New Vegas, especially also in the Lonesome Road DLC, is history, and how history shapes the perception of a people, of itself.
Yep.
And I know that there's this big tip you get as a writer in the beginning: never do the thing you want to do most in your life first. So were you already thinking back in the day, oh, in 10 years I'm gonna make the best history game, and I wanna put my feelers out into the thematics of history and how history works?
No, I mean, I would say that history, I can't take any credit for Lonesome Road. Chris Avallone directed that, but he was also building on stuff that a lot of us who worked on the core game, because I directed the core game and I directed Honest Hearts, and I did writing on it, and John Gonzalez was the lead writer on Fallout New Vegas, and we talked a lot about history, and a lot of the factions that we developed are very backwards looking. They're trying to recreate the old world, and even though we didn't set out with this theme in mind, eventually we sort of realized that there was this recurring theme of rebuilding the new world in the image of the old world. So NCR is trying to recreate the United States. That's all they're trying to do. They're trying to make the United States again. Caesar's Legion is trying to create this very weird military version of ancient Rome. The kings are inspired by Elvis. They want to be Elvis. The great Khans are trying to understand who they are through this very weird ahistorical lens of Mongols, basically. And so there's a ton of examples of characters that are very and societies that are very backwards looking, and they're trying to understand things through that lens. And so history, I would say, or rather sort of, let's say a historical materialist approach to world building is sort of central to how I view settings. So Fallout New Vegas, I approached with that in mind. Also Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, even though they have magic, there are still certain things that I was very careful about because I wanted it to feel like it could function as a world materially. So even if I wasn't doing something historical, I was using sort of historical academic training as a lens to view things through.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Playing the game, I was very enamored with the scenes where you would have a meal with someone. I was interested in what were your sources for that? What would you consult for this?
I can't think off the top of my head, but we did have a number of cookbooks from the period. Some of them were regional, some were not specific to Bavaria. They were a little more pan-European, let's say. But we did try to incorporate things that we had evidence of, either in cookbooks or just records of recipes of what people ate. And we did try to understand, again, from a material perspective, the peasantry does not eat as well as the middle class people, and the middle class people don't eat as well as the nobility. And that's reflected not only in the choice of food, but also things like flatware, glass, which the first time I think you can see glass in a meal is if you eat with Lady Salomea, Lawrence Rothvogel's wife, and you're like, whoa, shit, like, this is glass, and it has wine in it, and it has candied oranges that were brought directly from Italy. Fantastic. Must be nice. But, we tried to pull from, what was grown in the region, what did people eat? For people that were highly mobile and wealthy, like nobility, what would be transported to them? You also eat a meal with Father Garnet, and it was typical that the abbot would eat much better than the other monks. And so those considerations shaped all of those choices. And then there were some where we kind of just took a good stab. And so far I haven't heard anyone say that anything is like super bad. At least there are no potatoes. That's the most important thing. I am good. So let's see who breaks first, me or you guys.
First of all, thank you so much for this fantastic lecture and for coming to Vienna. It's awesome. My question is the following. So from the narrative point of view, this game being highly historic, and you talked a lot about getting into heads of people who lived during the time, reading their diaries. But like the team of writers, obviously being from the 21st century and being influenced by our modern society, what hardships did you face while trying to write those people, and like how did you get around not making them too modern?
Yeah, it's a really difficult balancing act. So one is embracing the idea that ultimately, physiologically, we're the same as those people. Things have changed over the generations, but we're not that dissimilar to people in that time. So like the way our bodies work, the way our brains work, obviously we live in a different material reality, but basically saying these are just people. So if it feels like a way that a person would respond at a gut level, it's probably going to be correct. There were certain things and subjects that we avoided simply because it would have been too alienating. So one of the things that came up is child abuse and spousal abuse, which would probably have been rampant in this time period. We're not doing that. So there are two characters that are verbally abusive towards their spouses, and that was about the limit. We just said, like, there's no real good reason to get into the weeds on this. Yes, it is more modern to exclude that stuff. Also things like rampant anti-Semitism. Let's just not do that. Again, we choose the stories we tell. No good reason to include this in this story. So there are Jewish characters present, but they're on the side, and if the characters in the town are huge racists, you don't see that directly. Just no good reason to embrace it. So, we wanted ultimately the players to sympathize with these people, and we wanted them to feel like they were close to us, even though they live in a different world. And so that was usually the guiding principle, was to not alienate the player from this world, while also not making the characters feel like they just walked off out of the street. So, and it was, a lot of times it was touching, like it was, we'd write something and then look at it and go like, does this work? And then people look at it and they're like, I don't think it does. And we're like, oh, let's change this. This is not, no. And so there were a few times where we just rewrote something. but nothing so dramatic that it was like, wow, we really changed the whole story about it. I do think one of the things that I did want to convey is infant mortality, which is really dire across the world prior to the 19th century. So in some parts of Europe, infant mortality would be 50%. 1 out of every 2 people. That's like almost impossible to conceive of, but that was the reality in a lot of places. Maybe more generously, 30%, which is still crazy. So conveying that, but also because there's this perception of like, well, people just got used to kids dying and they were fine with it. I don't think they did. I don't think there's any evidence of that. I think that's a projection where people just say like, yeah, they treat kids under the age of 2 as just kind of Tamagotchis, and they don't no, I don't think that was the reality. So showing how different characters responded to that in game, I felt was important, and because again, I think that people would respond much like people would today.
Thank you.
So I guess my question sort of bounces right to the end of the talk. And the sort of wider aspects of history, game development, how they interact. I mean, to give the background from which I'm asking this, we've had a workshop series that I've convened based at the university here, although it's an online event for the last few years, which is effectively let's chuck a bunch of game developers and a bunch of historians in a virtual room for a weekend to see what happens, which is a lovely thing to do. We had Zoe Franzik along a couple of years ago, but it is always consistently harder to find people and spread out among game development communities compared to academic communities. The historians are always queuing up in large numbers. The game developers are harder to reach. I mean, obviously the crunch and pressure of game development makes it much harder for people to make space to kind of openly build those sorts of things. So I guess I was wondering if you had any wider thoughts on how do we build these collaborations better? What else can we do?
That's a good question. I don't know if I have great answers, although I will note that academic institutions exist and have structure and are interconnected in a way that game devs aren't necessarily. So it might be finding the right medium through which to spread information about this, whether that's like certain Discord channels or LinkedIn or something. But I just think that the academic community is more interconnected than game devs are. So that's probably one part of it. Also, every academic, like I said, that I've talked to is like, oh, you want to hear about, art between Hungary and Italy under Matthias Corvinus? I am there. I'm going to talk to you about it. But not every game developer is into history. And so whether it's an availability thing or some people just aren't quite as into it, I think the pool is going to be just a little more limited overall. But I think probably it's about finding the right venue for communicating it. Because I know people are out there. There are a lot of game devs. So, yeah, good luck.
Okay, maybe I think we got through all the questions. I'm scared to look.
I think there's one more.
Really? No, please. No, we're not gonna stop now.
As the temperature climbs.
Okay. So you mentioned stuff like historical gray areas and also that not every historical topic is given the same attention. So I was wondering, what was actually the hardest aspect to research when it came to like medieval life?
This will sound, well, I think actually the hardest thing wound up being hunting that was not done by nobles. Because there's a lot of illustration and records about how the nobility hunted. Now, other people did hunt, but it was largely illegal to do so. So it was very hard to find anything written about it at all because all the focus was on hunts that nobles did. And I found one text from 1910. It was in Fraktur. But it was actually easier to read than the 1999 German academic text. Because the language was so much simpler. I was like, I can read Fraktur, this is not a problem. But it included details about basically it was not about all the nobility and pomp surrounding it, it was how would people dress? How would they go into the wilderness? How would they prepare? It was like more practical stuff. So when we were doing the hunt that the miller can take you on in the mountains, he's not a noble, but he's basically given permission to hunt by the abbot. And I was like, I don't know what they would even do. And so, but I was able to get some details about how they would dress, how they would go out, what weapons they would use, things like that. But it was really hard. I had to go to Ed Kern, and then Ed Kern had to search, and then he came back. He's like, I have one PDF. It is a scan of a photocopy, and it's in German, and it's also in Fraktur. And I was like, all right, give me it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Oh, there's one more.
I had a question. Since the font system was so significant in this game, how did it work in the Russian and Chinese translations?
So, yeah, that's something that was really hard because initially what I had said is if we localize these into other writing systems, then I want to localize all the fonts. Which isn't to say that I wanted to literally make new versions of them, but I said I want to find equivalents of them. And there were people at work who had, because this is the tricky thing, it's not only you have to find someone who is a native speaker, but also has enough of a scholarly background to understand different writing systems. So there were a number of Korean people at the studio who could help figure out different writing styles and systems. And in the end, I was like, I am out of my depth here. Like, I can't do this. Like, I don't know enough about it. And also the expense would have been very high. There were a lot of legal considerations because I was like, well, we can source this from Google Fonts and this from Adobe and this. And I'm like, oh man, this is going to be a mess. And then the other thing is that all the stroke masks, do that with simplified Chinese. Like, no way. So one, we couldn't do the variety of fonts, and also we couldn't do the stroke masks. So we did individual fonts. I think there might have been a couple languages where there were like 2 fonts, one for sort of like fancy and simple. And then we did a common sort of like gradient fill, left to right or right to left. And that was as much as we could do because, basically putting it in perspective, ideally it would have had as much attention as it did to make them in the first place, but that's crazy. Because that was like, so, on the technical side, that was by far the most amount of work. So I'm sorry that people playing in other languages don't get to experience the full richness of all the Latin stuff that we did, but that was just a trade-off we had to accept. So like I said before, I'd rather people be able to play it than not play it.
Thank you.
Thank you for the talk again. You mentioned not opting for the voice acting, also due to just not having the resources to do it. Were there any other parts you really wanted to do but couldn't because of time or like resource constraints?
I'm trying to think if there's anything really significant that we didn't do. I don't think so. I think almost everything else that we thought of, we pretty much executed it as we envisioned it originally. I've been making games long enough that I usually have a pretty good sense of how expensive something will be. So there were so for example, the end of Act 2, without spoiling anything, very dramatic, very big. I said, that's a still image. That is not going to be something that we're going to animate in real time. It's going to be a very beautiful illustration. There was one point I remember, it was funny, because I was kind of speaking contemporaneously, I wasn't really thinking about it, and I was talking about the Christmas feast in Act 3, and I was like, yeah, and everybody's dancing, and the animator just groaned. And they're like, you understand that that's shorthand for, we're gonna screw up your whole animation schedule, right? I'm like, nobody's dancing, nobody's dancing. A couple of people are tapping their feet, and they're like, that's fine. So, yeah, there's nothing really big, I wouldn't say. I think everything else was sort of conceived at the scale of the project. Yeah, I think that's probably it.
Okay, I think we'll wrap it up for now, but thank you guys so much for coming and for asking all these wonderful questions and engaging in this way with the material. I do have to make a couple of shout outs or thank yous. Thanks to Obsidian Entertainment for providing us with some codes for tonight. So who hasn't tried out Pentiment yet can do so on the consoles of the Vienna University Game Lab. I highly recommend you check them out. They also have a mailing list there that you can subscribe to. They do amazing things with teaching history through games. And I would also like to shout out the Arbeitskreis Geschichtswissenschaften and Digitale Spiele, which will have a collection of essays about Pentiment coming out sometime soon. Also a very exciting, great network on subjects such as this. And of course, the Vienna University Library has you covered with all the books you need for your own project, or just out of interest researching what other references there are in Pentiment. We brought some modern books here that you guys can check out. We have over 30 libraries all over the city of Vienna. So if you want to see Andrei Rublev, you go to Theater, Film und Medienwissenschaften. If you want to check out the book that Christopher de Hamel wrote on manuscripts, you go to Kunstgeschichte. So we're happy to take all your requests. And yeah, last but not least, you guys can take a look at the old and valuable books here that are actually early printed books from the time that Pentiment plays in. We're a lot of people in here, so I would ask you to keep a respectful distance when you look at them, but there'll be people from the library there to contextualize it and talk to you about it as well. So once again, thank you so much for coming. Is there anything else you want to say as a goodbye?
Thanks, everybody. I appreciate you coming.